So we'll get started, as I'm conscious of everybody's valuable time. And first of all, I would like to welcome you all to our webinar, where we'll be discussing why disruption is the new normal, led by Professor Andrew Stephen, who is the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing at Saïd Business School. And before we get started with Andrew and I hand over, just as a quick overview, I am Helen Trudgeon. I'm the Associate Director of the Leading Disruptive Growth Programme here at Saïd Business School, and this is what today's webinar is associated with. This is an annual programme that we run, a 5-day on-campus course, which is looks at developing visionary leaders within the global environment and those who are looking at disruption and how it can be used as a force for growth within their organisations. In terms of benefits, it's an opportunity to discover unique ways of delivering growth within your organizations, particularly using disruptive technologies. It also takes a look at all the various elements that are causing disruption within organizations now, which I'm sure Andrew will be touching on shortly. It also helps our participants translate their vision into robust, stress-tested plans, which is part of the on-campus course that we deliver, helping them to deepen their understanding of how they can lead change within their own organizations, particularly in terms of organizational structure, but also within the culture of an organization. And one of the benefits of using Saïd Business School is actually our association and participant within the University of Oxford, which gives us access to faculty and also industry leaders from around the globe. So it creates that unique combination of practitioners and academic faculty bringing their knowledge together. And another benefit is that you can become a lifelong member of the Oxford Business Alumni Network as part of the programme. Very quick details and key facts. As I said, we deliver it on campus in the centre of Oxford in our flagship campus. It's a 5-day course, runs Monday to Friday, and our next course runs in April. We also welcome a diverse cohort. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is that we have a very, very international offering of individuals from across the globe and also across all industries. And in terms of male to female ratio, it's about 1/3, 2/3 at the moment, and we are welcoming applications as we speak. Just quickly a slide of emailing, but that's enough from me. And I would like to hand over to Professor Andrew Stephen now. As I said, he is the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing at Saïd Business School. He's been with us for just over 7 years now, and he is the Programme Director of Leading Disruptive Growth. Thank you, Andrew.
All right. Hello, everybody. And yes, I'm Professor Andrew Stephen, the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing at the Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. Thank you for joining us. I wear a few different hats at Oxford. I'm also the school's Deputy Dean for Faculty and Research and run a research centre called the Oxford Future of Marketing Initiative, where we work with lots of different companies around disruptive growth strategies and how to deal with disruption from all different sorts of sources. And what I thought I'd share with you in the webinar today is just a few perspectives that I have on disruption and what that means. It's sort of a word that's, we throw around a lot. But I'll give you my take on it and how, as business leaders, we can think perhaps in a more proactive and frankly positive way about disruption instead of a reactive and negative doom and gloom type approach to disruption. Because it is, the new normal. It is what it is, and it has been kind of forever, quite frankly. But how we deal with it and identify business growth opportunities from macro forces that are disrupting our markets, for example, is really, I think, the strategic imperative that business leaders that are effective today and prepared for the future need to take on. So I'm going to talk about that. I'll go through a few different things in relation to that, and I do want to encourage anyone who's joining us today to please use the Q&A function if you've got any questions. I'm going to keep my eye on that on the screen, and and there'll be a little bit of time towards the end of our time together for me to kind of go through some of those questions. So please do post things into the Q&A. I can't guarantee that I'll get to every single question, but I'll do my very, very best to do that. So we're talking about disruption and it being sort of in some sense the new normal, and us trying to think about what can we do about it. And like I said, the perspectives I'm going to offer are coming from some of the research that myself and colleagues at the Side Business School do, working with people, I'm sure, like yourselves, working with business leaders, people running businesses of all shapes and sizes in different industries and different markets around the world, where actually there's some common themes that come out of the research and the conversations that we've been having over many years now related to this. So I'm going to kind of share with you some of those takeaways. So the plan is to talk about the context here of disruption as a constant, provide you a little bit of a framework for taking action, keeping in mind that it's not just me sort of telling everybody what we already know, that the world is a disruptive place, but rather what can we do about it, or rather how do we want to think about approaching taking strategic action as business leaders. I'll also then share something that we use on our Leading Disruptive Growth program at Oxford called the Disruptive Growth Mindset, which is sort of a framework for thinking about how to be an effective disruptive growth leader in businesses. And then, as I said, we'll have some time for Q&A towards the end. So let me get into this notion of disruption as a constant. Now, I'm going to go back to before COVID, because often we talk about, oh my gosh, the last few years have been very, very disruptive. And I wanted to just share with you a little bit of data from 2019, which seems like maybe a lifetime ago for some of us, but it isn't that long ago. But it's certainly before some of the more recent macro disruptions in the world have occurred, and it comes from PwC, the global accounting and consulting company. And they've been doing sort of an annual CEO survey over the years, and this is just to provoke some thought, really, from their 2019 global CEO survey. One sort of piece of data that comes out of that around CEOs' confidence in growth in the future. And as you can see, sort of the headline there, CEOs' curbed confidence spells caution. Well, what that's coming from is what you can see here on the slide. So this chart is the red line over the years that they've been doing this survey is the confidence level of CEOs in there being good revenue growth prospects in their organizations. And it's sort of the percent of CEOs being very confident that there are good growth prospects for revenue over the next 3 years. The light gray line is the same thing, the same question, but their confidence for the next 12 months. So, what you could sort of see, if you just kind of look at that red line, pretty stable, if you will, from sort of, 2010 through to, say, 2017. Then it started falling. You also saw relative stability in that gray line. There's sort of 12-month confidence, or 12-month prospects, forecasts, confidence, and then it also dropping off. And so the reason for this, if you were to read their report, was uncertainty in the world, worries about all sorts of issues around supply chains, which might, be familiar to us today as well, all sorts of issues. So confidence in growth prospects has been declining before we even had a big disruption such as COVID. So this was happening, 3-4 years ago, where business leaders around the world, and this was true around different markets. If you look at the data in say the Asia Pacific versus EMEA versus North America, Europe, wherever it is, similar trend, similar pattern in terms of a decreased confidence in growth prospects because of uncertainty and doubt about what's going to happen next in their local markets as well as the global market. And that's related to disruption indeed. So this was happening back in 2019. And then, of course, we saw this happen. So COVID happened, but then this happened. So political unrest, something like the January 6th last year attack on the US Capitol after the Trump loss of the election, and then this happened. So the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and that war ongoing, and what that's doing to things like energy prices, and then this happening with inflation, and so on and so on. So it's been this constant stream of doom and gloom in the world, quite frankly. But if we bring that back to business, what don't we like in business? It's uncertainty. And so we've certainly got tons of uncertainty at the moment. And these are just some obviously, kind of obvious macro level examples. But then in your market, in your industry, in your company, even in your local areas, you would have versions or variants of these disruptive forces that are putting pressure on the business and its fundamentals, and disrupting your workforce, disrupting your customers, and disrupting the ways that you operate. So we have to deal with whatever comes next. But the reality of this is always going to happen. So when we want to think about disruption, I think we can talk about whatever comes next, and how we would react to that. And that's fine. But what I would contend, and I'd certainly encourage, we certainly do this in the Leading Disruptive Growth program and other executive education programs that we work with people on, is to encourage people to think about positive disruption. Now, positive disruption in an organization is when you're thinking about opportunities more than threats, but you're thinking about really a paradigm shift in the way that you go to market, or the way that you engage your customers, or the way that you manage your operations or structure your business. So it's not about incremental changes, it's about big paradigm shifting changes, which is disruptive, but can be a positive disruption in the sense that it can unlock more growth opportunities for revenue and bottom line profit for an organization. So really, when we think about disruptive growth and how do you lead disruptive growth, what we've got to do as leaders is kind of get off that defensive footing, that reactive way of being, which I've just been talking about with all these things that happen in the world, into a much more proactive, visionary, paradigm shifting approach. And that's hard to do because that involves visionary leadership, that involves innovation, that involves change management in order to implement, that involves thinking about new marketing strategies and new customer management strategies. So all the different functions of business have to come into some sense of alignment when we think about more positive disruption, that's paradigm shifting to help grow the business. But that's how you survive. That's how you thrive, actually, more than survive in an inherently uncertain landscape. So the idea really is about turning that uncertainty into opportunity, and embracing that uncertainty, because the complexity that the world throws at us is a given, and we can't change that. So we might as well figure out ways to make the most of it. So in order to take action on that front, let me kind of walk you through a bit of a framework for this, or what I think of as a framework for action. And so we can think about it, we like to simplify things a bit, even though it's complex, into a bit of a 2x2, just for the the sort of the sake of us kind of attaching our minds to this way of thinking. And so if you sort of think about this vertical axis here, we've got this range between big global macro forces all the way down to local or micro forces. So all of those examples I gave before, COVID, war, inflation, political unrest, these sorts of things, they're all macro forces, typically with global implications. They might be globally impactful in and of themselves, something like COVID, or they might be concentrated in certain parts of the world, but with global repercussions, something like the conflict in Ukraine at the moment, or political unrest in the United States, for example. these are big enough macro forces that they sort of transcend and go across international boundaries and have impacts on financial markets and commodity markets and economies, and therefore people all around the world. So we can categorize these forces of disruption in sort of the more global sense or macro sense, but we can also, and we should, think more about what's going on right underneath our noses in our in our neighborhood, so to speak. Whether that's literally local geography factors that might be particularly relevant to your business operations, or local market, beyond, say, local city, but maybe local state or country, region, perhaps as well. But you could think about this in your industry, so you don't need to adopt a geographic way of thinking around this. It could be more in your industry, whatever that industry might be. There are particular changes taking place that are particular to your line of business. So you can think about local/micro in various different ways, but not just geographic. So it's important to think about this categorization, and we'll come to exactly why that's important in a minute. But just for a second, though, the reason why we want to have this type of categorization is some things are beyond our direct control, but many are actually within our grasp. And we want to look for opportunities in those things that we can have, quite pragmatically speaking, we can have an impact on, which may well be more down the bottom of that continuum in terms of local micro forces. The other dimension here, the horizontal dimension, is thinking in terms of threats versus opportunities, or costs versus profits. I often like to kind of translate that too. And again, we can think in terms of, let's say, inflation as a threat, and it's putting pressure on our cost structure because it's increasing our own costs of doing business. And then we need to think about how do we pass them on to our customers, and can we pass them on to our customers, and what are their cost structures like, and so on. So we can think about everything from that left-hand side, threats, costs. But we can think about it, we can reframe it, which is a big part of the message actually here, which is actually, can we turn those things into opportunities? Even some kind of big challenging thing going on in the world, are there opportunities for growing our business that we can generate off the back of those forces, those factors of disruption, which might become more profitable for us, or create new business opportunities in one way or another. So I tend to think about global, local, and then threats, opportunities, and this is a way to think about it. And then if we think about kind of what the four boxes would then be, you've got, if I kind of work my way sort of left to right, top to bottom there, we can use this as a way to prioritize. So if we think about actually the global macro forces that are just inherently costly and threats, they're that sort of top left quadrant, they're just hard to address. There's not much that you can do as a business. You have to accept the fact that there's back during COVID, there's a pandemic. That makes it harder to do business. That affects our revenue and our costs, and it's a global macro thing. So there's very little that you can do directly as a business. You have to weather the storm. So you're not going to find much opportunity there. Although sometimes with things that are hard to address, if you can reframe those things that are hard to address, those big global macro forces, if you can try and find some opportunity in them, if you shift over to the right-hand side at the top there, you've got new growth opportunities. And actually, if we just pick on COVID as an example, think about what that did from a digitization standpoint in a lot of industries and a lot of different types of business. It accelerated digital transformation. It certainly accelerated the move towards more digital ways of doing business, whether that was in retail, shifting more to e-commerce, whether that was in, let's say, B2B sales, finding new ways to use technology to enable sales to still happen when you couldn't go out and go visit your client or your customer. So even from something that was inherently global and macro that you couldn't change, that was a threat and certainly costly, there is often some silver lining which you can generate some new growth opportunities out of, and to do that, it's a reframing type challenge, really, to sort of reframe those threats and the costs into opportunities and profits. So you can think about it in those sorts of ways, but inherently the big global or macro forces are often either impossible to directly affect from your own business's standpoint because they're beyond your reach, or if you could affect them or you could affect change there, it's going to be very, very slow moving. There's a lot of inertia built into that. So it's probably best to not prioritize looking for new opportunities in those parts of the quadrant, or those quadrants rather, in the framework, just because they're inherently difficult. But if we go to the bottom half, I think this is where we can find some opportunities. So if we think about, first of all, low-hanging fruit there, we're talking about local or micro forces, things that are changing, maybe just in your company, or maybe your industry, or maybe your local market, that are threats or costs, but actually what they are is they're problems to be solved. And I see them as low-hanging fruit because they're within your grasp, they're within your sort of realm or domain of influence, since they're more local, they're not big global things. Yes, they might be threatening your business or perhaps incurring you costs, but if you can find a way around them, then you've solved the problem. So there's sort of the low-hanging fruit way of thinking, and I'm sure many of you have examples in your own context that you could relate to on that front. The other side here is where I think can be a really ideal place to focus, and so the point I want to kind of hone in on more than, let's say, the other three, because if we think about disruptive growth and we think about leading disruptive growth and developing, sort of taking a leadership perspective and developing strategies that will give you this growth that you're needing through positive disruption, what you've got to look for is that sweet spot between local or micro forces that are, external factors impacting your business that are within your domain of influence, whether that's in your market, geographically, or in your industry, or maybe just within your company itself, that are positive, that lend themselves to new opportunities, lend themselves to new ways to new profit opportunities, or new ways to enhance or grow the profit that you're already getting out of existing lines of business. That's the ideal place to focus. So when you're thinking about a framework for action in responding or reacting to forces of disruption, out there in the world and out there in the market, and if you're trying to think about, well, where do we focus our efforts? The ideal place to focus is that bottom right corner there, because that's where positive disruption is mostly going to come from, and that's where, from certainly my experience and all of the work that we've been doing with business leaders over the years related to this type of framework and these ideas around positive disruption, that's what you tend to find works best. Doesn't mean you ignore the other quadrants in the framework, because there are opportunities to be had, but that often is going to be slower moving and or require more work to reframe or turn a threat into an opportunity that you can then work with, or there's going to be more stakeholder management and engagement required to really turn a ship. If you think of the business as a ship and it's a slow moving oil tanker, for instance, it's going to take a while to turn it. So you don't want to avoid those challenges, because there could be massive upside from tackling those challenges, but at the same time you need to be realistic and weigh the cost and the time of tackling those really, really big, difficult things against something that might be more likely to yield some positive returns in let's say a shorter period of time, or perhaps with sort of less effort and resource investment required. So it's a portfolio approach, I guess, is another way to think about it. But when we want to sort of take the reality of constant disruption and turn it into action, I think the first step is to categorize the landscape in this way, and then use that to help you identify a sort of a prioritization of the strategic options then available to you. So very pragmatic approach, I suppose, but that's how you also reduce the inherent uncertainty of a complex world, is to put some structure on things and use that to guide the deployment of resources and the sequencing of actions that you could therefore take. So that's that idea. What I wanted to shift now towards, though, is this other idea, which is more of an individual perspective. So when we think about disruptive growth and building a disruptive growth strategy and leading on both the strategy development and strategy execution in this sort of more innovation-driven, positive disruption space, we can think about it from a strategic standpoint, which is essentially what we've just been talking about. But we also, I think, need to think about it from more of an individual leader aspect. And so I wanted to share this framework with you and talk a little bit about it as well. Because you can't have one without the other. You can't sort of have the more organizational corporate strategy or business strategy bit without thinking about the individual leader components, and vice versa. And so we, and over a number of years, probably about the last 4 or 5 years, myself and some colleagues have been developing what we call the disruptive growth mindset, which is a leadership framework, if you will, kind of building on some other work that's already out there. But we've been measuring this as sort of behind each of these four circles, kind of around the periphery of the image. There are sets of measures that individuals can take. You could do them yourself. You can do them with your team. You can compare and contrast across different teams in the organization and different leaders compared to other companies. So there's a measurement tool behind this that we've been validating for a number of years in lots of different industries and for different sorts of leaders from around the world. But what we seem to find pretty consistently is that leaders and teams actually that score high on these 4 characteristics are best equipped to take advantage of disruptive growth opportunities, like the ones we were just talking about in the context of that framework I showed you. So let me just explain what these 4 characteristics are. So the first one is action orientation. It basically means getting stuff done. So we're talking about leaders who are focused on kind of being more agile, moving things forward, taking action. Sort of when we were originally developing this, it's sort of in interviews with leaders, it was quotes like, less talk, more action, or fewer committee meetings, more results. Those sorts of things. It doesn't mean a gung-ho approach to doing business, or a lack of consultation, or a lack of proper stakeholder management and employee management, and so on and so forth. But it just means that you're always keeping your eyes on taking action instead of spinning your wheels. And that's culturally difficult in some companies. Some companies tend to be very slow moving, very conservative, and that's not inherently bad, and they can be very, very successful. But if you want to be more of a positive disruptor, and use that sort of way of approaching things to fuel a growth strategy, then less talk, more action, or having an action orientation is an important characteristic of a leader, of a team, of a leadership team, as well. So that's number one. Number 2 is strategic focus, which is kind of necessary if you would think about leadership. We need to have a strategic focus. We need our eyes on the prize. We need to have clear objectives and solid plans for achieving those objectives in determined timeframes. So that's all a given. What's different here, and what we've found from working with disruptive growth leaders over the years, is their strategic focus is informed in a couple of different ways. One, it's, I guess, the more conventional strategic management approach. So, goals and measures, KPIs or OKRs, or whatever the system is, and not being tactical, being strategic, so forward-looking, future-oriented, and so on. But there's another component here which seems to be a really good fuel for growth, and that's what I would call thinking about who you compare yourself to. And so the benchmarking aspect of a strategy process, for example, we tend to find is disruptive growth mindset from a strategic focus standpoint also has leaders who compare themselves and their teams and their organizations to, I guess, unusual comparisons, to completely different companies, to completely different industries. So they're not just kind of measuring themselves or considering themselves against kind of the obvious. And actually maybe the most extreme example of that is just comparing yourself to where you were last quarter or last year. So year on year or quarter on quarter is relative to yourself. So you can think about relative to yourself, relative to your colleagues. You can think about relative to other direct competitors, others in your industry. But what about relative to non-competitors? What about relative to other industries, other markets, other types of leaders? And that outside-in focus tends to be really important strategically and give new ideas. And actually, it particularly helps when you're doing quite well, and I'm sure many of you have been in this position where everything's going fine and you don't really want to rock the boat, and often things are going fine because you're comparing yourself to yourself a year ago or 2 years ago or whatever it is. And so relative to the past, yeah, you're doing fine. But what about relative to other companies? What about higher growth companies? So it forces you to not get kind of resting on your laurels, I suppose, or bogged down in complacency. So that's the sort of a unique element of strategic focus here. The third one is off-radar intelligence, a little bit related in terms of it's about looking outside of your normal frame of reference. And so what that really means is, if you think about as a leader, you're running your business, you're doing what you're responsible for. You're also responsible probably for generating growth. And I suspect because you're listening or watching this, you're thinking about growth. Well, where are those ideas going to come from? Where are those sources of inspiration going to lie? And often we focus on what's familiar to us. So I think about that as what's on your radar. If you kind of think about, imagine we all had sort of, a screen on our laptop or our iPad or whatever that was sort of your dashboard, but your intelligence radar, if you will. And everything on that radar, the little blips on your radar, insights and intelligence coming from, inside the company, your existing customers, your direct competitors that you're very familiar with, and so on. So familiarity. And that's fine, because that might be necessary for sort of operational day-to-day management and leadership. But rarely are completely new ideas going to come from what's on your radar. So if you imagine what's in that circle of your radar, imagine that there's all sorts of little blips on that radar that are outside that screen, that are off radar. That's where new growth opportunity ideas come from. That's where some valuable insights and valuable intelligence can come from. Not necessarily the solution to an immediate business problem, but definitely what I would call conversation starters, or the kernels of an idea that you can then work on and develop and see if it's actually going to be relevant to your business. So this could be, kind of like what I was talking about with strategic focus. This could be looking at completely different industries. This could be looking at other types of customers that aren't your customers today. This could be looking at different types of companies. And it can be really, really valuable. And I'll give a quick example. I'm actually literally right now, with one of our executive education clients who's going through a digital transformation. They're sort of a manufacturing and industrial company, business to business type enterprise. And what we're seeing with them is for them to figure out how to innovate from a digital standpoint and identify new business opportunities digitally. They need to look beyond their industry. They need to look outside of the box to get some real new growth opportunities. It's not to say that within their industry there aren't opportunities sitting there in front of them as well, and indeed there are, but they're a leader in their industry. So if they look at just what's on their radar, they're going to be seeing competitors that are behind them. They need to get out ahead and keep on staying ahead. So they have to have off-radar intelligence, which is a leadership mindset. For someone to sit in a meeting, for example, and say, yeah, great, we're talking about all these things that we already are familiar with, but has anybody ever thought about what happens in the whatever industry that no one has ever thought of? And then just provoking that more out of the box thinking becomes really, really valuable. And we've seen that work very, very effectively. Then the final element of this framework is challenging. And this one is really about going up against the status quo. And some what I've certainly experienced over the years, dare I say, experienced it in every organization I've ever worked in, is sort of almost an ingrained reluctance to deviate too far into the unknown. So in other words, to kind of, if we've done something before and it's worked pretty well, then we're going to want to stick with that because it's a safer bet. Not a safe bet, not 100% certainty it's going to work again, but it's perceived as being less risky than something completely new, which is reasonable, and it's certainly human nature for us to think that way. However, that can stifle growth. That can result in opportunities not being identified, let alone seized and turned into something that is valuable. So how do you get out of that? So you need a leadership quality called challenging, which is simply saying, yeah, but hang on a second, what if we didn't do it that way? Someone who's going to play the devil's advocate. Now, an individual may not want to do that 100% of the time. You might not be very popular around the boardroom table if you're constantly being the contrarian or the dissenting voice. But it's a very, very healthy thing to have in strategic decision making, or strategic conversations that lead to strategic decision making. And one thing that's actually worked very, very effectively in a number of organizations has been, on a team, appointing someone, literally giving someone the role of, you're the challenger today or this week or whatever, so if it's an important strategic discussion, to kind of tell someone, look, everybody's input is valuable here, but, hey, Andrew, could you also at some point make sure you challenge us? Just to make sure we don't get stuck in one way of thinking, to make sure that we question our assumptions. So it's about just making sure that that's part of the process, which requires psychological safety, which means it's very helpful if you appoint someone to that role. You say, it's your job today to be that person. Some people will naturally be that. And then when we measure this on people, some people just score highly because that's sort of part of their personality. But for some people, it's not part of their personality, and they find it actually very uncomfortable going against the status quo or going against the sort of the collective view in the room. But from decades of research that people have done on things like poor decision making, groupthink, brainstorming that goes wrong, and so on. Everybody just agreeing and not challenging becomes a real problem. Some cultures are better at it than others, or more likely to do it than others. But it's a leadership tool that you have at your disposal, regardless of the culture that you're in. And what we found is drive positive disruption that really leads to outsized opportunities for new growth opportunities in business. You need to have that challenging part of the conversation as well. So it's a really, important framework, if you will, when you sort of think about this combination of big picture business and corporate strategy. How do we kind of roll with the punches, take the disruptions that are out there in the world and reframe them to be more positive, and then use them to identify opportunities for growth and more profit and better outcomes for our businesses, combined with what does it take internally as a leader for you personally to do that. These are qualities or characteristics, sort of leadership personality traits that we see being particularly helpful in that disruptive growth, in the pursuit of disruptive growth opportunities positively for a business. So that brings me to the end of kind of the main things I wanted to talk about, and I'll switch to questions briefly. And so please do, if you've got any questions, feel free to pop them into the Q&A. But just to summarize, we need to accept that disruption is a constant, and we need to make that known in our organizations and with our colleagues. So in some sense, that's going to avoid the reacting all the time, always feeling like we're in crisis mode, which is draining and exhausting. Or avoid what happens in some organizations, which is a bit of a head in the sand approach, where we sort of, the deer caught in the headlights and just don't want to deal with these things. That's also not going to be good for growth. So we need to accept this. We need to set action priorities and be realistic about them. So, we can't change the geopolitical situation in the world, but we can look at opportunities right under our noses in our local markets, in our industries, in our own businesses. So being realistic about where you want to invest resources, people, money, time, becomes really, really important, because resources are obviously scarce. So setting priorities is a key. Having a leadership mindset behind this is also absolutely critical, and it's a different type of leadership mindset. So if you're going to be more about positive disruption, trying to drive growth through paradigm shifting, sort of sensing the market, looking for opportunities to do something new and different, and then going with it, that requires a different approach to leadership, not a completely polar opposite approach, but slightly and meaningfully different areas of focus in terms of sort of leadership characteristics that you bring to the table and that you bring to your teams and you bring to your colleagues. And if you think about all of these things, then that can lead you down the path of being able to turn external disruptions into positive disruptions of your business models. It can create entirely new business models, but it can also help you adapt existing business models to fuel future growth of those business models. So let me kind of leave the formal part of the presentation there. Personally, I get very excited and interested around thinking about positive disruption and how it can grow businesses, because I think we spend a lot of time reacting. We spend a lot of time not thinking enough about what the future can hold for our teams and our businesses. And this is a way of getting us to think about new opportunities, even though there's a lot of stuff going on around us that gets in the way, or results in us having to put out fires all the time or react and and deal with uncertainty. But I think if we can turn that inherent reality of uncertainty and complexity into some positives and then build opportunities out of that, it's a much, much more positive way to approach business, particularly in a fast-moving, innovation-focused environment. And we see from the work that we've been doing over the years that really can pay off and help businesses grow and be more successful. So with that, let me switch over to some questions. And let me start with the question that came from someone who's asking about, is disruption better than collaboration? Well, actually, you need collaboration to pull off this disruptive growth model that I'm talking about. So in fact, collaboration is key. Because if you take the leadership mindset that I just walked you through, those 4 points: action-oriented, strategic focus, off-radar intelligence, and so on, it's requiring a team-based approach. Not one individual, it can probably be strong on all of those elements. Not everybody can be that fourth one, which is challenging. Not everyone can have that off-radar intelligence, either the time to do that or the inclination or the ability to do that. So you need to collaborate to even just have that leadership team mindset, let alone think about other innovation opportunities that come from that. So I think you absolutely need collaboration as part of this. That's for sure. Now the question comes around either industries, examples of industries or geographic regions that are better positioned to deliver disruptive growth, or is it more the mindset of the individuals in the organization? I wouldn't say there's any particular geography. If I kind of start with that, this is not something that you could, say, I don't know, one part of the world is just inherently better at than another part of the world, or one sort of national culture is different. Because the reality is, yes, we can make stereotypical assumptions about different parts of the world, but those of us who've lived and worked in different parts of the world realize that it's a lot more complex and heterogeneous than any kind of broad sort of generalization. And so you don't tend to find any major geographic differences as a result. What you do find is some industry differences, that's for sure. So perhaps unsurprisingly, more conservative, entrenched, slower to move traditional industries tend to be a bit slower at being able to do this. Doesn't mean they can't do it. So I'll give you, one example that oftentimes people like to pick on in terms of slow moving or traditional is the financial services industry, banking, for instance. But no, banking is entirely capable of positive disruption and disruptive growth strategies. Oftentimes, though, some of those disruptions have to come from new entrants to the market that have completely rethought business models. So if fintech is the prime example there. So could more flexible retail banking driven by tech and apps and so on, the sorts of things that consumer-facing fintech offer, could that have been thought up in a big incumbent 100-year-old bank? Absolutely. They're undoubtedly, but did it need to come from outside to sort of shake up the way that banking services are offered to retail customers? Yeah, it did, just because of the culture of those sorts of very long-standing conservative organizations. So sometimes you need sort of people to go from outside to disrupt then from within. Other industries, less. The tech industry, for example, sort of digital retail, commerce, and so on. Those industries are all pretty good at updating and disrupting their business models just as part of how they do things. But if there's any one thing that we tend to see is the businesses that are encumbered by legacy systems. IT is an example of legacy systems, but it doesn't have to be like, it could be old processes and old policies. But sort of companies that are older tend to be a bit harder to move. But that's a bit of a trend that we've seen, but not necessarily that strong. So I would say, in answer to the rest of that question around, if it's not geographic or industry differences, is it more about the mindset of the individual organizations and the people in? Yeah, this is very much an organizational culture thing. This is very much about an enablement, creating an environment where more disruptive growth, positive disruptive growth thinking can thrive, giving people the space, the resources, the safety to try new things. That's what's needed. And I'm a firm believer that can happen in companies that are sort of born that way, but it can also happen in companies that make the effort to become more that way. It's just a matter of deciding, are you going to prioritize that or not, and where do you see the value? So thank you for that question. Let me go to another one. So another question is, how would I advise on encouraging disruptive behavior in cultures with a high power distance index for leadership and for lower ranks? Yeah, so this gets back to a little bit about other geographic differences, not distances, differences. And here it's a little bit more about, I'd say, yeah, you could say that there are, we could have some broad generalizations, cultures with a high power distance or a low power distance, for example. But, in every, organization where, it's in a high power distance country, there'll be people sitting there who kind of individually are a low power distance and vice versa. So it's more about understanding not so much the culture in the country, let's say, but the culture in the organization, or even the business unit within the organization if it's a larger organization, and figuring out where do people kind of sit, where do they land in terms of whether it's power distance or their perception of psychological safety or their willingness to take risks, whatever it might be, or however you want to think about it. So what you do is you get the lay of the land, and then you tailor your leadership approach to that. So if everybody's inherently willing to sort of shake things up, then you just need to give them the kind of the go ahead to do that. Versus if people don't want to shake things up because culturally in the organization that's just not how things are done, then even if you said, hey, go and here's money, here's a budget for some kind of moonshot crazy innovation project, doesn't matter if it fails as long as you learn something, no one's going to sign up for that. So you then need to take that first step as an intermediate step to get people to feel comfortable with that, and then go on for something that's about positive disruptions. So I wouldn't say, I would avoid generalizations. I would instead think of it from a leadership standpoint of what the people that you're trying to work with, that you're influencing, where do they fall on this? How susceptible or receptive are they to what it is that you're hoping to do from a disruptive growth standpoint? And then figure out, can you go with that straight away, or do you need to do some groundwork first? So hopefully that's useful. Thank you for that. So some other questions here. I know we've got a couple of minutes left to wrap things up, but if I go to, I'm just looking at the questions here. What are the costs of disruption, and how are they measured? Well, it's a good question. And you need to balance the upsides with the downsides, if you will. Like anything in business, you need to think about cost benefit here. But I would kind of, maybe this is me avoiding answering the cost question, but it's not because I don't have an answer, but actually I think a different way to think about it might be informative. And that's to think about, what's the cost of not thinking disruptively. So when you're trying to think about, okay, well, do we need to pursue disruptive growth here? Or the alternative to disruptive growth, by the way, is incremental growth. So are we doing a big paradigm shift, changing things in a bigger way? That's disruptive growth. If we're doing just little incremental, maybe a % year-on-year growth type of thing, that's incremental. And then the distance or the gap between that in terms of the potential opportunity, that's the cost of not going disruptive. And then you've got to weigh that against, okay, well, what would it take to do the change, to do maybe change management, in investment in new technologies or whatever it might be. So I think of it in terms of the bigger cost benefit equation, and where the benefit is really, kind of doing that comparison in terms of the opportunity cost of not going with something more disruptive. Think about what that is, whether you can put numbers on it or not. Is it big? Is it small? Is it this? Is it that? And then weigh that against what it would take to do that bigger positive disruption. And so think about it in that more cost benefit way, where the benefit is really the opportunity cost of just sticking with incremental growth, and see where that would get you. But great question. Thank you so much. I might do one more quick one, and then we'll have to wrap things up. So let me go to the question here about business leaders. How can business leaders use this information to manage their investors' expectations? Great question around thinking about stakeholders, obviously investors being one of them. So we know that investors don't like uncertainty, but we know that uncertainty is a reality, and it's just something we have to accept here. So I think in terms of more disruptive growth strategies from an investor standpoint, managing that group of stakeholders, and I'd say managing boards and non-exec directors and so on related to that, is to think in terms of how is this helping manage the macro uncertainty, and if this is a way to help manage or mitigate the uncertainty that you've seen in the market as it pertains to your organization, then it should be a positive in the eyes of those sort of external stakeholders, investors in particular. But I'm not saying this in terms of, this is just how you position it or frame it, but rather thinking in terms of, is a more positive disruptive growth approach versus the incremental growth approach, is that actually going to help you manage uncertainty? And off radar intelligence is a really, really good example of that, from that leadership mindset framework, because that is about sensing opportunities that exist outside your typical frame of reference. And sometimes you might have uncertainty that pertains to your frame of reference, or you're on radar in a certain way. But if you can bring outside ideas in, that's going to be a mitigating force against that uncertainty. And if you can communicate that effectively, demonstrate that it has value relevance, then that should be a positive from an investor standpoint, as opposed to, it's just more uncertainty and taking on more risk or whatever else. But great question. Thank you so much for that. All right, well, we're right on time. So you've probably heard plenty from me. Hopefully that was interesting and useful, and gives you something to think about. It's in sort of a 45 minutes to an hour, there's only so much we can do. So my goal was to really be thought-provoking more than anything else. But I want to just say thank you very much for joining us. I'm now just going to hand it back to Helen, who kicked things off at the start, so she can wrap things up. But again, thank you for watching, and I wish you all the best on your disruptive growth journeys.
Thank you, thank you, Andrew. That's a really informative taster, which I hope has whetted everybody's appetite. And I hope you've found some great takeaways from what Andrew's been able to share with us today. And if you are interested and would like to learn more about leading disruptive growth, as I said earlier, we are recruiting for our next cohort in April next year. I'll just put up the slide again of how you can get in contact with us. I'll just share screen with you. And please don't hesitate to get in touch if you've got any follow-up questions that you'd like to ask Andrew or me or Tanuja. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you very much for joining us today. I enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Thank you.